They say blood is thicker than water. But I'll let you in on a little secret. The thickest blood is the kind that forces you into a DNA test to claim your inheritance, and then discovers the daughter you buried 40 years ago is still alive and already holding the shovel. This is the story of Albert Dent, a man whose family tried to bury his truth only to dig up their own grave. Welcome to Dad's True Revenge. Hit subscribe and find out what happens when the dead don't stay dead. Albert Dent was 74 years old when his own children cornered him in a sterile law office and pushed a DNA kit across the table. They wanted proof of bloodline, they said. Proof that he was really their father before they'd agree to split the estate he and his late wife had spent 50 years building. The same children he'd raised, fed, and sent through college were now treating him like a stranger with a checkbook. So Albert swabbed his cheek. He had no reason to fear a test. What he didn't know was that the lab report wouldn't just confirm he was their father. It would name a daughter he'd been told died at birth 40 years ago, a daughter who wasn't dead at all, and who was already holding the files that would decide his family's entire future. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the afternoon the swab was taken. Albert Dent sat in a beige conference room at Lowell and Chase, the law firm his children had retained. Mitchell, Lydia, and Elaine, his 3 surviving children, were lined up on the other side of the table like a parole board. Not a single one of them could look him in the eye. They stared at the kit, at the table, at the lawyer they'd hired to handle the estate, but never at him. Margaret had only been gone 3 months. 51 years of marriage, and Albert hadn't yet learned to sleep on his side of the bed alone. Dent Fabrication, the precision metalworks company he and Margaret had built from a single stamping press into a mid-8-figure enterprise, now sat frozen in probate, and his children were treating the estate like a puzzle that only solved itself if Albert proved he belonged in it. Mitchell had been the one to speak. My father, 52 years old that spring, the eldest. He'd leaned forward, rested his forearms on the polished wood, and said, "Dad, this isn't personal. We just need to make sure everything is clear before we divide the assets. A DNA test protects everyone. It eliminates any questions. Any questions." What Mitchell meant was, are you really our father? Or maybe, are there any other claimants hiding in the woodwork? Albert couldn't decide which was worse. For 3 weeks he'd argued, but Lydia, always the sharp one, had finally cornered him with a single sentence: if you refuse, the court will only delay the probate for years. You know how this looks. And so, on a humid Tuesday in June, Albert Dent rolled a cotton swab inside his cheek, sealed it into a sterile tube, and watched his children's lawyer, a calm, efficient woman named Nell Harding, write his name on the evidence bag. Nell Harding was new to the firm, a probate specialist with steady brown eyes and a voice that sounded like she never had to raise it to be heard. She'd been thoroughly vetted by Mitchell, who bragged that he'd hired the best. She never smiled unnecessarily, which Albert respected, and she never treated him like an old man, which he respected more. As she collected the sample, she'd met his eyes and said quietly, "Mr. Dent, the lab will run a comprehensive familial analysis. It confirms parentage and also flags any previously unknown genetic matches. Are you comfortable with that full scope? I've got nothing to hide," Albert had said. And he believed it. He and Margaret had married in 1963. She'd given him 3 children. The only ache, the only shadow they never spoke about, was the 4th. A girl, stillborn in 1984. The doctor had been grim, the death certificate final, and Margaret had spent the rest of her life unable to set foot inside the nursery they'd painted pale yellow. Albert had buried the grief so deep he sometimes forgot it was there, but the DNA test would not forget. The sample was shipped to a private genetics lab in Richmond. The lab guaranteed results within 4 weeks. Albert went back to his empty house, watered Margaret's rose bushes, and waited. His children called exactly once to confirm the tracking number. What they didn't know was that the lab, like most modern labs, ran every sample through a national relative matching database unless the client opted out. The Dents had not opted out. And so, while Albert was pulling weeds and Mitchell was already mentally spending his share, a set of algorithms was quietly connecting dots that had been scattered across 40 years of deliberate silence. 4 weeks later, on a Monday morning that smelled like rain, the same group reconvened in the same conference room. This time, Nell Harding held a sealed manila envelope. The lab seal was intact. The report inside, labeled Dent Family Genetic Analysis, Confidential. She slid it open with a letter opener that clicked against her wedding band, slid out a sheaf of papers, and began to read. Mitchell, Lydia, and Elaine met first. Their DNA profiles aligned precisely as expected, each one a biological child of Albert and Margaret Dent. Mitchell exhaled like a man who'd just been handed a receipt. Lydia allowed herself a tight, satisfied nod. Elaine, the youngest at 47, actually said, "Well, that's done." But Nell Harding hadn't finished. Her eyes had moved further down the page. Her reading pace slowed, then stopped entirely. The silence stretched long enough that Mitchell finally snapped, "What? Is there a problem?" Nell looked up, then directly at Albert. Her professional mask cracked just enough to show something human and unsettled beneath. "Mr. Dent," she said, "the lab has flagged an additional familial match. A previously unregistered biological child. A daughter, born September 3rd, 1984. She was listed as deceased in the state registry, but the genetic sample that matched you is from a living woman. She is your daughter, and according to the report, her name is—" She turned the paper around, and the name on it crashed into that conference room like a cymbal. Because the name on the report, the daughter Albert had buried without a grave. The child who had supposedly died in her mother's arms 40 years ago was stitched right onto the blazer of the attorney who had just opened the envelope. Nell Harding. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that room breathed. Then Mitchell Dent shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor like a scream. "That's not possible," he said, jabbing a finger toward the paper. "You're telling me our attorney is our dead sister? This is some kind of sick joke." Nell Harding had not moved. Her hands were still resting on the report, the same hands that had opened the envelope, but now they were trembling just enough to be noticed. She stared at the name on the page, then slowly lifted her eyes to meet Albert's. He was watching her with an expression she would later describe as half hope and half heartbreak, the face of a man who had just been told his child's grave was empty. "Margaret said she held her," Albert whispered. "The doctor let her hold her. She was cold," they said. "Blue," his voice broke on the word blue. Nell swallowed hard. "Mr. Dent? I have no idea how this is possible." But the lab report left no room for doubt. At the bottom of the page, printed in clinical font, was the confirmation, probability of parent-child relationship, 99.9997%. Subject, Albert Franklin Dent, Sr., and subject, Nell Catherine Harding. Conclusion, biological father and daughter. The test had cross-referenced Albert's DNA with a national relative matching database, one that included a consumer kit Nell had submitted 5 years earlier. She'd spit into a tube for a company named GenieMap to learn her health markers. What she'd actually done was leave a genetic fingerprint that had been waiting silently for the right sample to collide with it. And on this Monday morning, it had. Elaine was already crying, short, shallow gasps that nobody moved to comfort. Lydia was the only one who seemed to be thinking clearly, which in Lydia's case meant calculating damage. "We need to confirm this with an independent lab," she said, her tone clipped. "This could be a database error, contamination, anything. We can't take one report at face value when the estate is at stake." She turned to Nell with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No offense, of course. I'm sure you understand." Nell nodded slowly. "Of course, but I should recuse myself from the estate proceedings immediately. There's a clear conflict. I'll notify the firm and have them assign a new attorney." Mitchell's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Oh, you think that's it? You think you can just walk away and this goes away? You've just been named a potential heir to a fortune. How convenient that you're already inside the legal machinery." Albert's voice cut through the noise, quiet, but heavy as a wet blanket. "Sit down, Mitchell." His son hesitated, the bully's calculus playing out behind his eyes. Then he dropped back into his seat. Albert turned to Nell. "You said you took one of those ancestry tests. You were adopted?" She nodded. "I was adopted at 3 days old through a private agency in Charleston. The file my parents received listed my birth mother as a teenager who couldn't keep me and a father who was unknown. I was born September 3rd, 1984, at St. Catherine's Hospital, the same hospital where Margaret gave birth." She paused, and her voice caught for the first time. "I was told my birth mother died in childbirth. I never looked too closely. I didn't want to open that wound. But the death certificate for a stillborn girl named Doris Margaret Dent was filed at St. Catherine's on the exact same day. The silence that followed was the kind you can feel in your teeth. Because if Margaret Dent had given birth to a stillborn baby, it meant someone had taken Nell and switched her in the nursery. Or worse, that the stillbirth had been a lie, and a healthy baby had been stolen and sold into adoption, while the grieving parents were handed a cold bundle of linens. Either way, the same question now hung over the conference table like smoke: who had done it, and why? Albert reached across the table and laid his hand on top of Nell's. It was the first time he'd touched her, his calloused fingers from decades of working the stamping presses overlapping her slim attorney's hands. "I want to know you," he said. "If you're open to that, I want to know my daughter." Mitchell's mouth opened to object, but Lydia silenced him with a simple shake of her head. The tactical shift was instant. If they pushed too hard now, they'd look like monsters. Instead, they'd let the story play out and find another way to contain the damage later. Nell, to her credit, did not crumble. She withdrew her hand gently and said, "Mr. Dent, I want that too, but right now there's a legal process to protect. The estate is already contentious. If I'm biologically your child, I have legal standing that could complicate the probate beyond anything your children are prepared for. And to be honest, based on what I've already seen in the estate files, there are discrepancies that need to be addressed regardless of my Dina." Mitchell stiffened. "What kind of discrepancies?" Nell turned to him with the same steady calm she'd used in 100 depositions. "The kind I was going to raise with the family next week. The kind that involves several large transfers out of Dent Fabrication's operating account to a shell company registered in your name, Mitchell, in the 6 months before your mother died. Transfers that weren't authorized by the board." Now the conference room erupted. Mitchell's face went from red to purple. "How dare you? You've been rifling through private records to manufacture a claim against me. You're not our sister, you're a con artist." Elaine sobbed harder. Lydia pressed her fingertips against her temples like she was trying to stop a migraine, and Albert sat back in his chair, looking at his eldest son with the dawning pain of a man who had already lost a wife, then a daughter. and was now watching his family devour itself from the inside. Over the next week, the war began in earnest. Mitchell retained a separate attorney who immediately moved to have the DINA results excluded from the probate hearing on grounds of chain of custody irregularities at the lab. Lydia hired a private investigator to dig into Nell's adoption, looking for anything that could paint her as a fraud. Elaine stopped answering her phone. Albert, meanwhile, sat in his empty house with copies of the lab report and the adoption file that Nell had finally obtained from the sealed records in Kanawha County. The file was thin, a few pages typed on an ancient machine, but it contained a name neither of them had expected. The delivering physician, who signed both the stillbirth certificate for Doris Margaret Dent and the adoption paperwork for Nell Catherine Harding, was the same man, Dr. Raymond Cawley. And Raymond Cawley wasn't just an obstetrician. He was the brother-in-law of the hospital administrator, a man named Gerald Upton, who had disappeared in 1992 after a billing fraud investigation. The trail was old, cold, and littered with the kind of bureaucratic dust that protects old secrets. But Nell, who had built a career on finding the fatal detail buried in 1,000 pages of discovery, found one more thing. In the adoption file, a slip of paper no bigger than a receipt, tucked behind the notarized consent form. It was a handwritten note from Dr. Cawley to the adoption agency, Baby Girl Healthy. Mother Margaret Dent deceased. Father listed as Albert Dent, but he is not to be contacted. Payment for placement has been made. No further questions. The note was dated September 4th, 1984, the day after Nell was born. Albert stared at that note for a long time. His wife had not died in childbirth. Margaret had lived for another 39 years. And yet the doctor who placed his daughter for adoption had written mother deceased as if it were just another box to check. Someone had paid a doctor to steal a child. But who? The obvious answer was someone who stood to gain. And the only people who stood to gain from removing a Dent baby were the ones who didn't want another heir dividing the pie. Mitchell was 8 years old in 1984. Lydia was 6, Elaine 5. Too young to orchestrate anything themselves. But their grandfather on Margaret's side, Howard Prentice, had been alive and powerful, a founder of the hospital board, and a man who had reportedly never forgiven Margaret for marrying a factory worker named Albert instead of the attorney he'd chosen for her. Howard Prentice had died in 1991, taking his secrets with him. Or so it seemed. Until Nell Harding, now Nell Harding Dent, by choice, if not yet by legal right, uncovered a letter in Howard's archived estate filing. A letter in which he instructed his personal attorney to handle the situation at St. Catherine's regarding the undesirable fourth child. The letter was ambiguous enough to be explained away, but it was also specific enough that when combined with Dr. Cawley's note, it painted a picture no jury would ignore. The family, of course, tried to bury it all. Mitchell's legal team filed a motion to seal the estate proceedings entirely, arguing that the DINA revelation was a private family matter with no bearing on the legitimate division of assets. Lydia leaked a carefully crafted rumor through the local business community that Nell was a gold digger who'd fabricated the test results. And then, 3 weeks after the DINA report, Mitchell made a move that he believed would end the whole thing. He called a private meeting with Albert, without Lydia, without Elaine, and without lawyers. Just a son and his father in the den of the old house. "Dad," he said, "I've talked to the board. We can settle this quietly. We'll give Nell a lump sum to go away. $50,000. Enough to make her comfortable, but not enough to destabilize the company. If she doesn't take it, we fight the DINA in court for years. You'll be gone before it's resolved, and the company will be torn apart in legal fees. Everyone loses. This is the only way. Albert looked at his son for a long moment, then turned to the window and watched the rain streak down the glass. So you're asking me to pay off my own daughter to disappear, just like someone did 40 years ago. Mitchell's voice hardened. I'm asking you to protect the family that actually raised you. The one that's been here. Not some stranger who fell out of a database. Albert didn't answer that night. But the next morning, he called Nell and asked her to meet him for breakfast. And when she sat down across from him at a diner that had been serving pancakes since before she was born, he pushed a slim folder across the table. Inside was not money, but a letter of intent to formally recognize her as his daughter and to amend the estate plan to include her as an equal heir, retroactive to the date of the Dina test. It had been drafted by a new attorney, a man Nell had never met. Albert had gone behind the family's back. I'm 74 years old, he told her. I've spent my whole life bending to the people I love, thinking I was protecting them. But I never protected you. I'm not going to let anyone bury you again. Mitchell received a copy of that letter the following day. And 6 hours later, Nell Harding received a call from the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee. An anonymous complaint had been filed, accusing her of tampering with a Dina sample, fabricating evidence, and exploiting a vulnerable elderly client for personal gain. If the complaint was upheld, she would lose her license. She would lose everything she'd built. The family was no longer trying to bury the result. They were trying to bury her. And they had no idea just how much paper she had already gathered on the real fraud hiding inside Dent Fabrication. The next move was hers to make, and she was about to show them exactly whose blood ran through her veins. Nell Harding received the ethics complaint at 8:47 on a Friday morning. It came via certified mail, the kind that requires a signature, the kind that tells you before you even open it that someone is taking aim at your entire career. She signed for it in her kitchen, still wearing the blazer from the night before, and read it standing up. The complainant was anonymous. Anyone can file with the Bar Association, but the accusations were detailed: tampering with a Dina sample, fabricating a lab report, exploiting a vulnerable elderly client. The language was surgical, designed not just to question her competence, but to dismantle her character. She didn't panic. She made a pot of coffee, sat at her dining table, and laid out everything she had. The binder was 3 inches thick. She had been working on it quietly for weeks, long before the Dina results ever came back. Because when Albert Dent's children first pushed that swab kit across the table, Nell had already flagged the estate's financial discrepancies. She hadn't been investigating her own birth then. She had been investigating Mitchell Dent. And what she'd found was a pattern of theft that went back 7 years. Mitchell had been skimming from Dent Fabrication for nearly a decade. 7 years of padded invoices, 7 years of shell companies, 7 years of wiring operating funds into an account in the Cayman Islands under the name Prentice Holdings, his maternal grandfather's name. A little tribute. By the time Margaret Dent was diagnosed with the pancreatic cancer that would kill her, Mitchell had siphoned just over $2.8 million. He'd done it slowly enough that the board didn't catch it, but fast enough that the company's profit margins had been softening year after year, blamed on market pressures. Nell had found the first thread by accident during a routine estate valuation. She'd requested the company's internal audits, and the numbers didn't add up, so she'd pushed deeper, quietly, because that's what she did. She never tipped her hand. Now, with the ethics complaint sitting on her table like a loaded gun, she realized Mitchell had made a catastrophic mistake. He'd assumed she was just a probate lawyer. He had no idea she'd spent her entire adult life learning to survive. She was adopted at 3 days old, raised by good people, but always looking over her shoulder, always a little too aware that the ground beneath her could shift. That instinct for document trails, for buried truths, had made her an exceptional attorney. And now it was about to save her life. She called Albert. "Can you meet me at the diner?" Same booth. He was there in 20 minutes. She slid the binder across the table, opened to the first tab. "Mitchell has been stealing from the company for years. Here are the wire transfers, the fake invoices, the shell company in Howard Prentice's name. I was going to present this to the family next week, as part of the estate settlement. But now he's filed a complaint to have me disbarred. So I'm going to do something I don't normally do. I'm going to play offense." Albert stared at the pages. His face, already worn thin by grief, aged another decade in the space of a breath. "He stole from the company my wife built." His voice was ragged. "He stole from his own mother while she was dying." Nell didn't look away. "Yes, and I think he knew about me. Not the whole truth, but enough to be scared. The Dina test wasn't just about proving you were their father. Mitchell pushed for the full familial analysis. He wanted the database flagged. I think he'd heard a rumor, maybe from someone who worked at St. Catherine's back then. He wanted to see if there was a secret sibling out there, someone who could come after the money. He just didn't expect it to be me." The full weight of that realization landed on Albert like a physical blow. His own son had used a Dina test not to confirm his father's identity, but to hunt down a potential heir and eliminate them before they could file a claim. And the tool he'd chosen was the very attorney he'd hired to protect the estate. The irony was so sharp it drew blood. Nell spent the next 72 hours building an offensive. She filed a counter-complaint with the Bar Association, providing a detailed affidavit that laid out Mitchell's financial fraud. She filed a motion in probate court to freeze all estate assets and appoint an independent trustee, citing the embezzlement evidence. And she sent a letter to the Board of Dent Fabrication, with copies of the fraudulent wire transfers attached, requesting an emergency meeting to discuss the company's financial integrity. She also filed a complaint with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She did all of this before the sun went down on Monday. Mitchell's retaliation was instant. That same evening, his attorney held a press conference on the courthouse steps. She was careful, trained, but the message was clear. Nell Harding was a delusional woman who had manipulated an old man into rewriting his will. A woman who had fabricated a birth story to claim a fortune that wasn't hers. The story hit the local news that night, and by Tuesday morning, the phone at Dent Fabrication was ringing off the hook with calls from worried suppliers. But Mitchell had not anticipated the third person in the room. Elaine, who had spent weeks sobbing and avoiding conflict, walked into the board meeting the next day and asked to speak. She carried a manila envelope of her own. Inside were bank records she had gathered from her mother's personal accounts, records that showed several large payments from Margaret Dent to a private investigator in the months before she died. Payments for a search. Margaret had been looking for her lost child. She had never told Albert, because she didn't want to break his heart if the search came up empty. But she had suspected something wasn't right about the stillbirth. Elaine had found the investigator's final report buried in her mother's safety deposit box. It concluded that the doctor who signed the death certificate had also been named in a separate inquiry about illegal adoptions in the mid-80s. Margaret had died before she could act on it. Now, Elaine slid the report across the table to Nell. "I think my mother would have wanted you to have this." That single gesture cracked something open inside the family. Lydia, who had been quietly watching the strategic landscape, suddenly reversed course. She was not a sentimental woman, but she understood leverage. She called a meeting with Albert and Nell without Mitchell. She came alone, holding a coffee cup, and said, "I've spent my whole adult life keeping Mitchell from destroying this family. I thought managing him was my job. I see now that I was enabling him. Tell me what you need." The alliance was fragile, but it was real. And once Lydia switched sides, the entire institutional machinery shifted. The board of Dent Fabrication, which had been wavering, now voted unanimously to suspend Mitchell pending an independent audit. The Bar Association, faced with Nell's counter-evidence and a growing public scandal, quickly dismissed the anonymous complaint against her as without merit. The local paper, which had run Mitchell's version of events, now ran a front-page correction that included quotes from the investigator's report and a photo of Nell and Albert standing together outside the diner. The headline read, "Family's own Dina test uncovers not a fraud, but a lost daughter and a deeper crime." Mitchell was cornered, but not finished. He did what desperate men do. He lashed out at the one target he could still reach. He appeared on a local talk radio show and accused his father of mental incompetence, claimed that Nell and Albert were conspiring to seize the company, and hinted darkly about unethical relationships between the two. The host asked if he had any proof. Mitchell said, "I don't need proof. Look at who profits." That was the moment Albert Dent chose to speak publicly for the first time in his life. He didn't issue a statement through a lawyer. He walked into the local newspaper office, asked to speak to the reporter who'd written the correction, and sat down for an interview that lasted 2 hours. He told them about the day Margaret gave birth, about the nurse who had handed them a cold bundle and told them not to look, about the closed casket funeral. He told them about the Dina test, about the look in Nell's eyes when she read her own name on the lab report, about the late-night phone call when he decided he would not lose his daughter twice. And he told them about the binder. "My son stole nearly $3 million from his own family," he said, his voice calm but cracking at the edges. "He stole from his dying mother. He filed a false ethics complaint against an innocent woman. And now he's on the radio calling me senile. I am not senile. I am heartbroken. But I am also free." The interview ran on the front page the next morning. By noon, the district attorney's office had opened a criminal investigation into Mitchell Dent for embezzlement, fraud, and witness tampering. The FBI, already involved peripherally, scheduled a formal interview with Nell, and the hospital administrator's old records, the ones Nell had been quietly pulling from archives in Charleston, finally gave up their full confession. It turned out that in 1984, St. Catherine's Hospital had a quiet side business. Wealthy families unable to conceive could pay a premium to Dr. Cawley and a small ring of nurses, and a healthy newborn from a mother who was told her baby had died would be delivered to them, with fresh paperwork and a sealed file. The ring had been small, maybe a dozen babies over 7 years, but it had been ruthlessly efficient. Howard Prentice, Margaret's father, had known about it. He'd paid for it. He'd arranged for his own grandchild to be sold because he wanted to control the family line, to keep his daughter's blood pure in his own twisted understanding of that word. He'd chosen the adoptive parents himself, a childless couple in Charleston who would never question the paperwork. And Nell, sitting in her small apartment with the photocopies of those documents spread around her like the pieces of her own shattered history, realized that her entire life had been a weapon waiting to be loaded. The family that had tried to erase her had placed her directly in the path of the one job that would give her the skills to uncover exactly what they'd done. They had paid for a lawyer, and they had gotten a detective. They had paid for a daughter's silence, and they had gotten a voice that would not stop speaking. The State Bar investigator closed the ethics complaint with a formal finding of no misconduct and a rare note of commendation for Nell's extraordinary integrity under extreme personal pressure. The probate judge, after reviewing the full file, removed Mitchell as co-executor of the estate and appointed an independent fiduciary. And Albert, holding a new will drafted by a firm with no connection to his children, formally recognized Nell as his daughter and left the entirety of his estate to be divided equally among all 4 of his living children, with the explicit condition that Mitchell's share be reduced by the amount he had stolen, plus interest, before any distribution. The family that had tried to bury a child had instead handed her the keys to their own vault. But the final revelation, the one that would shatter every assumption about who had been steering this story from the shadows, was still waiting in a sealed file that Nell had not yet opened. And when she did, she would discover that the woman who had raised her, the adoptive mother she had loved and mourned 12 years earlier, had been keeping one last secret that connected the 2 families in a way no one had ever imagined. Nell opened the sealed manila envelope on a Thursday evening, 3 days after the probate judge had frozen Mitchell's assets and appointed the independent fiduciary. The envelope had no return address, just a stamp from a law firm in Charleston she'd never heard of, and a note clipped to the front to be delivered to Nell Harding upon the resolution of the Dent estate matter. Per the last testament of Martha Harding, her adoptive mother had been dead for 12 years, and she had left instructions for a letter to be held until this exact moment, as if she'd known what was coming. Inside were 2 items, a handwritten letter on pale blue stationery and a photograph that had yellowed at the edges. The photograph showed 2 young women in nursing uniforms, standing shoulder to shoulder on the steps of a hospital, their hair pinned up in the style of the early 1960s. Nell recognized her mother immediately. The other woman, the one with the bright laugh, caught mid-sentence, was a stranger. She turned the photo over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, Martha and Margaret, St. Catherine's School of Nursing, 1962. Friends forever. The letter was 8 pages long. Martha Harding had written it in the final months of her life, after the diagnosis that took her, and had entrusted it to a lawyer who had been sworn to silence until the Dent estate was settled. The first sentence was an apology. "My darling Nell, if you are reading this, it means the truth has finally come out, and I am not there to explain it to you in person. I am so sorry for that." What followed was a confession that rewove the entire fabric of Nell's life. Martha had been a nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital. She had been present in the delivery room on September 3, 1984, when Margaret Dent gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She had held the child, cleaned her, wrapped her in a standard hospital blanket. And then Dr. Cawley had taken the baby away, telling Martha there were complications and the mother was hemorrhaging. Martha had believed him until the next morning, when she heard that the Dent baby had been stillborn. She had delivered a live child with her own hands. And she knew, with the cold clarity of a woman trained to recognize a lie, that something was terribly wrong. She didn't speak up. She was a junior nurse, afraid of losing her license, afraid of the hospital board, afraid of Howard Prentice, who had already been a presence in the room that night, pacing the hallway, his face like a closed fist. So she stayed silent and watched the Dents go home with an empty bassinet. 2 weeks later, Dr. Cawley approached her privately. He said he knew she and her husband had been trying to conceive for years without success. He said he was aware that she had been denied adoption twice because of her husband's prior financial troubles. And then he offered her a baby. the same baby she had delivered. He didn't say it that way, of course. He called it a placement opportunity and told her the mother was a teenager who couldn't keep the child. But Martha recognized the infant. She recognized the small butterfly-shaped birthmark on the left shoulder, the shape of the eyes, the faint curl of hair exactly like Margaret's. She took the baby anyway. She told herself she was rescuing a child from a corrupt system. She told herself that Margaret had been told the baby was dead, and that giving the child a good home was better than letting it disappear into an unknown foster situation. She signed the paperwork, and she never said a word. The guilt corroded her slowly. She raised Nell with love, ferocious and unconditional, but the secret sat in her chest like a stone. When Nell turned 18, Martha had tried to reach Margaret Dent, anonymously, through a letter. She told her the stillbirth had been faked. She didn't name herself. Margaret had received the letter and had hired the private investigator. But by then, the trail was decades cold, and the hospital had long since destroyed the relevant records. Martha watched from a distance as Margaret searched, and she prayed that one day the truth would come out without her having to destroy her own daughter's sense of identity. She'd written the letter to Nell as her final act of courage. "I know you will be angry," she wrote, "and you have every right to be. What I did was wrong. I participated in the theft of a child from a mother who never stopped loving her. But I also gave that child the only home I knew how to build, and I loved you with everything I had. You are not a stolen object. You are my daughter, and you are Margaret Dent's daughter, and that truth belongs to you now." Nell read the letter 3 times. Then she drove to Albert's house and laid the photograph and the letter on his kitchen table. He looked at the picture of Margaret as a young nurse, her smile wide and innocent, and he wept. For the first time in 40 years, he wept not for what he'd lost, but for what had been hidden from him by people who had used their power to rewrite his family's story. Martha Harding had been a link in the chain, but she had also been the one who finally broke it. With that final secret out in the open, the legal machinery turned with a speed that surprised even Nell. Mitchell Dent's criminal trial was set for the following spring. Facing overwhelming forensic accounting evidence and the testimony of 3 former employees who had been coerced into helping with the embezzlement, he accepted a plea deal on the 6th day of jury selection. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of grand larceny, 1 count of fraud, and 1 count of obstruction of justice for filing the false ethics complaint. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in state prison, plus full restitution of $2.8 million. The restitution would come out of his share of the estate before he ever saw a penny. He would serve his time and leave prison a 60-year-old man with no inheritance, no boardroom seat, and no family who would take his calls. Lydia and Elaine, who had both cooperated with the investigation once the truth became undeniable, each accepted a revised settlement that left them as beneficiaries, but not as controlling shareholders. The independent audit revealed that Lydia had not known about the embezzlement, though she had suspected something was wrong and had looked the other way for too long. Margaret's friend, the private investigator's report, had been her turning point. Elaine, whose quiet courage in producing her mother's records had cracked the case open, emerged as the unexpected moral anchor of the family. She took a seat on the board of Dent Fabrication and slowly, painstakingly, began to restore the company's reputation. Albert Dent formally amended his will in a quiet ceremony at the same diner where he'd first told Nell he wanted to know her. His signature was witnessed by a notary and 2 regular customers who had no idea they were watching a man sew his family back together with ink. He left equal shares to all 4 of his biological children, but with a codicil that reduced Mitchell's share by the restitution amount plus interest, and that if Mitchell's heirs ever tried to contest, the entire share would be forfeited to a scholarship fund for adopted children. He also created a new position in the company, Executive Vice President of Forensic Auditing. He gave the job to a young accountant recommended by Nell, a woman who had never met a crooked ledger she couldn't untangle. Nell Harding's law license was not only preserved, it was elevated. She became a partner at a new firm that specialized in probate litigation and fraud investigation. She took on a caseload that included several families whose elderly parents had been manipulated into signing away assets, and she won each one with the quiet tenacity that had defined her entire career. She and Albert had dinner every Sunday night. They didn't try to pretend the lost years didn't happen. They just filled the years they had left with actual presence. He taught her how to prune Margaret's roses. She taught him how to use a streaming service. Neither was particularly good at the other's lesson. Margaret Dent's legacy, finally uncovered, became a small local legend. The story of the mother who never stopped searching, who paid an investigator out of her own hidden savings, who believed in her bones that her daughter was alive, was told at a memorial service that both Albert and Nell attended. They stood together at the back of the church, and when the pastor read Margaret's favorite verse, Nell felt something shift in her chest, a lock that had been closed for 40 years finally turning. The ring of doctors and nurses at St. Catherine's was investigated retroactively, but the statute of limitations on the adoptions themselves had expired decades earlier. Dr. Cawley had died in a car accident in 1993. Gerald Upton was dead, too, from a stroke in 2001. Howard Prentice, the architect of the theft, had been gone even longer. The only living person who could have faced charges was a retired nurse who had been on duty that night. But by the time the FBI traced her to a nursing home in Florida, she was 89 years old and unable to speak coherently. The justice system could not touch the original crime. But the family had delivered its own verdict. In the end, the DNA test that was supposed to confirm lineage and divide the assets had done exactly the opposite. It had unified the family around a truth that had been buried for 4 decades. It had exposed a thief, vindicated a daughter, and given an old man back something more valuable than his company. The knowledge that the child he had never held was not only alive, but had become the very force that saved him. And when Albert Dent finally passed, at 82, in his bed with the flannel sheets none of his children could convince him to throw away, he left a final note, handwritten, found by Nell in the top drawer of his nightstand. It said, "Margaret, I'm bringing our girl home." Albert Dent died on a Sunday morning in April, with the window open and the smell of Margaret's roses drifting in from the garden he had kept alive for her. The note in his nightstand was the last thing he wrote. But it wasn't the last word on his family. It was the period at the end of a sentence that had taken 40 years to write. The DNA test that his children forced on him didn't just name a daughter. It named a truth that no amount of money or silence could put back in the ground. And the people who tried hardest to bury that truth were the ones who ended up buried by it. Nell Harding buried her father next to Margaret in a plot he had chosen decades earlier, with an empty space beside it that he always said was for something that was still missing. The pastor read the 23rd Psalm. The board of Dent Fabrication sent a wreath. Mitchell, from his prison cell, sent nothing at all. Nell didn't expect anything else. She had stopped expecting her siblings to become people they weren't, and she had started building something new from the wreckage of the old. Here's the thing about a family secret. It doesn't stay buried unless everyone who knows about it agrees to keep silent. And in the Dent family, the silence broke, because one man refused to be managed. Albert was no longer the old widower in a flannel shirt, watering his roses, waiting to be told what to sign. He was a father who discovered that his family had stolen his child, and instead of accepting a settlement and going quiet, he chose to make noise. That noise changed everything. Nell's law practice grew. She became known as the attorney who could find the needle in the haystack of fraudulent estates. But she never charged a client who reminded her of her own case: the elderly parents whose children had turned their inheritance into a weapon. She said once, in an interview with a local journalist, "The law is supposed to protect the vulnerable. Too often it protects the people who already have the most." I learned that from my father. Both of them. The broader story here is not just about one family's drama. It's about what happens when we treat family as a legal contract instead of a human bond. Mitchell, Lydia, and Elaine wanted the test to confirm a bloodline so they could divide assets. They saw their father as a puzzle to solve, not a person to love. And in seeking to control the outcome, they handed the truth the keys to their own vault. The test didn't just find Nell. It found the embezzlement, the fraud, the decades-old corruption, and the quiet courage of an adoptive mother who finally confessed. All of it, every last piece, was unlocked by a single swab of Dina that was supposed to make everything simple. So here's the lingering question. How many other families have secrets locked in laboratory databases right now? How many people are one cheek swab away from learning that the person they trusted most has been lying to them for their entire lives? And how many of those people, like Albert, will choose to stand up anyway, even when standing up costs them everything else? We all want to believe our families are built on love, but sometimes they're built on paper, on lies, on the silence of people who were too afraid to speak. The Dent story didn't end with a perfect reunion. It ended with 3 siblings estranged, one in prison, and a daughter who found her father just in time to lose him. But it also ended with an old man's final note that said simply, "I'm bringing our girl home." And in his last act, he did exactly that. If you want to see more stories about the truth that hides beneath pressed tablecloths and polite family dinners, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can hand a person is the truth they asked for. Until next time, keep your eyes open and never sign anything without reading the fine print.